What I'm going to try and cover this evening is the landscape from the post-glacial environment, what it looked like when the ice sheets had retreated, through the Neolithic and Bronze Age landscapes, the Iron Age and its monumentalism, what the Romans did for Brampton Bryan and the surrounding area, the Dark Ages, medieval intensification, post-medieval diversification, and of course present and future challenges. The landscape, as we're all aware, is constantly changing, constantly evolving, and constantly has new pressures being put on it. And we think this is new. Some of it is. When I look at the landscape on our computers back in the office, this is what we see, which doesn't mean much to most people, but this is a screenshot of our historic environment record for the area around Brampton Bryan. You've got Brampton Bryan hidden under lots of red dots with numbers. You've got big purple squares and strange purple shapes. You've got Buckton Park up here with lots of numbers, clusters of numbers all over the place, and every so often little bits with dots in. This is just to give you an idea of, from a historical environment point of view, how busy this part of the county is. This isn't a sort of an exceptionally busy part of the county. This is fairly typical. We know a little about a lot, I think it's fair to say. So we have obvious big things. This is a Roman fort. It is that big, believe me. There's another one. This is Brandon Camp coming around here. Here's another Roman fort. And the different colours mean that it's designated as different things, that's all. And we'll go into that in my next lecture. So don't let the colours confuse you. I'll go into that in more detail. And from one extreme to the other, I thought it would be worth looking at the landscape in the raw, so to speak. So this is the vertical LiDAR of the Team Valley. So Brampton Bryan is just down here. There's Coxall Knoll, or the end of it. You've got Lenswoodine just up here. You've got the River Team meandering with all its false meanders round here. And you can see, really, it's incredibly flat. It's the confluence of the two rivers, isn't it? With this sort of low-lying area in between. And as we'll find out in a few minutes' time, the low-lying area is actually quite interesting. So what we know of historically is that once the ice sheets moved off, we had an area that began to get more and more tree-covered gradually as it warmed up. So it went from a sort of a very grassy sort of steppe-like terrain through to increasingly heavily wooded. And by, certainly in this area, this is a pollen chart taken from the Lug Valley quarries. So a very, very similar sort of environment to what we have in the Team Valley. And basically this is showing herbs and grasses and trees. And look what happens. The trees suddenly start to disappear and the herbs and grasses rapidly come up. And that point there is farming. So we have a severe loss of woodland, but a severe gain in grasses, cereals, etc. So what we think is happening around here is we have a very wet environment with a braided river of the Team, and a very wet floor with older carr, which is sort of older and willow standing in water. We have, at about 4000 BC, impact of clearance, so people cutting things down, burning woodland, etc. We have the woodland being reduced slowly, and then it rapidly speeds up with increases at grass and cereals. And by the time we get through the Roman period into what we call the Dark Ages, interestingly, they can't have been that dark because farming continued. The woodland didn't increase. In fact, if anything, the cereal and grassland increased. So you get this massive drop-off between the trees and the tall vegetation and the farmed and managed vegetation. And in the Bronze Age, early Neolithic, something like that. This is the sort of thing that the Team Valley would have looked like. So you get these braided rivers with back channels that are slowly silting up, with small groups of people that are hacking out parts of the primordial forest and turning it into grassland and areas where they can grow crops. And of course, they're using the river for fish, for transport, and for moving around the county. And certainly in the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, areas such as this, and again, this is Wellington Quarry, but it is very, very similar terrain, geology, etc. here. You get wet places that people are beginning to get attracted to. Certainly in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age, people liked doing ritual is the prehistoric term. We don't know exactly what they're doing, but it's something to do with funerary processes. And they're burying people or they're leaving offerings in wet places. And you end up with barrow cemeteries like this one. But these are ring ditches, they're called. So there's a ring with a small barrow in. And in the Lug Valley, you can see the old river coming through here. You've got ring ditches either side of it and a small little enclosure on it. So here's Buckton Park, and you have, this is the first edition with our HER put over it, you have tumuli written on here. There's one on that little bit, there's one on that little bit. This is all sticking out of this very boggy area that's been drained and drained and drained. But then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ring ditches. So you have basically a barrow cemetery in here from the early Bronze Age, late Neolithic. So an area where people came and did things at certain times of years to commemorate and honour the dead. And this is something that 20 years ago or so we would have thought was quite unusual in Herefordshire, particularly things that date from the Neolithic. The Neolithic in Herefordshire, we have a joke in the county. We found the Neolithic in 2006 in Herefordshire, and that means that we knew the Neolithic existed. We just didn't find any stratified structures and deposits that dated to the Neolithic. We found flints, we found polished axes and pottery, but we didn't find anything that was under the ground and still intact and in situ till 2006. And this continues right across the county. So 2007, we found this, the now famous or infamous Rutherworth Ribbon, just to the south of Hereford. And we have this gravel spread, which again is a sort of monument that people seem to have processed down and left burnt stones and quartz pebbles and burnt bone. And it has pits with burnt bone and offerings in it either side. So this again is a sort of ritual processual route. And it appears that it's been reused in the Roman period as a field boundary, so people knew it was here. We know that this was used on 2 occasions with about 200 years of not being used in between. So one is late, very late Neolithic, and then we're into the early to mid Bronze Age when it was reused. So they're reusing things at different times. And more recently, up on Dawston Hill, Manchester and Cardiff universities with Herefordshire Council have spent 10 years excavating a series of funerary monuments. This is a burnt down building which was then covered in stone and then covered in earth and turf. And these date from the early Neolithic. There's a group of funerary monuments ranging all along the ridge, culminating of course in Arthur's Stone, which is about half a mile away from this site here. So people were being very busy in the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age. It's surprising perhaps when you think how many people could have lived in Herefordshire in the Neolithic. How many people were here, bearing in mind that they were coming across from the continent, and what were they all doing? Well, they were farming. Herefordshire has always been good at one thing, and that's growing things. Whether it's got hooves or roots, it's good at growing things, and hopefully always will be. And this was very, very quickly recognised by our earliest farmers. and they took full advantage of the rich soils, the free draining soils as well. And I think the people that moved into Herefordshire realised at a very early date that this was a very important place. And whilst we as Herefordians, I think, tend to regard Herefordshire nowadays as being a very pleasant, quiet backwater, perhaps, where nothing's changing that fast. I think back in the Neolithic and early to Middle Bronze Age, that was completely different, and that there were quite significant groups of people wandering around and meeting up in places like Herefordshire and swapping things, trading ideas, bringing new things across from the continent. And it's at places like this and in these landscapes of sort of funereal monumentalization, if you like, that these people are meeting. They're having fairs, parties, religious ceremonies, and they're swapping ideas, they're swapping goods that have been brought in from all over the continent, from Ireland, from Scotland, etc. And it's this reason why we start finding things like a rock crystal on the top of the Dorston Hill that's come from the very north of Wales and areas like that. And why in places like the Olcan Valley we find glass beads from the west coast of Scotland. So Herefordshire's not always been a quiet backwater. And these are sorts of things that they've been burying. This is a very, very fine polished flint axe with a fossil in it, and they've polished it in such a way that the fossil makes this nice oval instead of a circle. And this is a beautiful flint blade. Never been used, either of them. This would have taken many hundreds of hours to make, and they've buried it on purpose. They've given it away in a ritual to show people that they cared, or they invested so much in the ancestors, and to bring them fortune, luck, whatever, guarantee a good harvest, we can only guess. And Bronze Age, this is a Bronze Age cairn in the Olcan Valley, right on the Welsh border near Longtown, that we excavated in 2010. And again, very, very complex building with this sort of curbstone around it, a dry stone wall filled with rubble, but inside that there was a timber chamber with burials inside that was then purposefully set on fire and collapsed, and then a series of burials around the edge as well. Who were these people? Well, we're guessing that these were the social elite, and that they were being buried and being afforded special rites, and then people would come and do ritual activities and bury things with them. And the Bronze Age really was, I suppose in many respects, we think it's underrated, because we look at the funerary monuments, etc., and then suddenly we get impressed by things like this. This is an Iron Age hill fort. In fact, this is Credden Hill Iron Age hill fort. This is the second largest hill fort in Britain. It's only slightly smaller than Maiden Castle. And one assumes that this was the capital hill fort for not just Herefordshire, but for further afield. And of course, everyone knows what an Iron Age hill fort is. I mean, there's one just over there, isn't there? And very nice it is too. The problem with that is that they didn't start life in the Iron Age, and they weren't forts, and quite a few of them aren't on hills. But other than that, Iron Age hill fort describes them perfectly well. We know now, having excavated quite a few in Herefordshire, that most of these had their origins in the Bronze Age, and they were simple enclosures that then got more elaborate throughout the Iron Age. So this is a LiDAR photograph, of course. For those of you that know Credden Hill, you'll know that it's completely covered in fir trees at the moment. So here's one closer to home. This is Coxall. So we are just down here. There's the River Team. And this is, again, a LiDAR capture of it, showing the banks and ditches. And it's highly likely, on the basis of what we know from excavations of places like Croft Ambry and various other hill forts, Ivington, Credden Hill, that the original hill fort took in the contour around here in the probably late Bronze Age. and then it got made bigger in the Iron Age, and then it got made even bigger in the Iron Age. And this is what we call monumentalisation. This is people building things, not just for defence. Obviously, you can use it as defence, but it's actually to show off. This is saying whoever has been in charge of building this could get it done. And there was definitely a hierarchy in the way that hill forts were created, and by whom and when. So the people that built this hill fort would have been local people. They didn't live in here. Hill forts were not places, certainly in Herefordshire, where people lived for long periods of time. People came up here at certain times of the year to do certain things. Things were stored up here. People came up here to enclose the areas for animals. They had fairs, they had markets, etc. up here. But the whole community didn't live within the ramparts of a hill fort. They lived in farmsteads and small villages all over the place, a bit like we do today. So, you know, to take things to the sort of utter pinnacle of showing off, here we have Herefordshire Beacon on the Malverns, and you know, this is a statement. This is something that's been designed to have been seen from miles away. All the hill forts, when they were constructed, were cleared of trees, or the hill was cleared of trees before they constructed them. And this is a statement saying, you know, you're now entering my domain. So not only did it start off being a series of rings on the top of the hill, but they then went to the trouble of adding these two massive lobes, all on the top of what is an incredibly steep hill with incredibly hard rock. And of course, no one would want to live up here. It's very nice on a nice day for a picnic, but you know, 3 weeks in the winter with very little water, it's not a pleasant place to be. So people came up here to do things, but this was actually a statement of whose territory was whose in the Iron Age. And we're beginning to see that these massive monuments that probably took 200 or 300 years to create by people that lived in little farmsteads like this. This is a typical late Iron Age or early Romano-British farmstead. There's an entranceway there, there's a dock there, which is a well. This is just off the A49, conveniently. There's another one just here, big trapezoidal one. They seem to be ranged fairly frequently across the flatter parts of Herefordshire, and they're taking advantage of the good soils. They're farms. They had sort of extended families in. So here is a sort of artistic impression of that one with you know, 2 or 3 domestic huts, a poultry store, and then some corrals and bits and pieces in the middle of fields. And it's the fields that are the important piece as far as the Herefordshire landscape is concerned. In the Neolithic and Iron Age, Bronze Age, the fields were very small, and the permanent pasture areas, the ridge tops, etc., were huge. And the reason for that was cattle. In the Neolithic and Bronze Age, cattle were very, very important. They were the small, almost sort of Dexter or Welsh black type of cattle. And we now know from research done on the teeth of skulls from places like Avebury and Windmill Hill, where they had these massive feasts and put the skulls in the ditches of causeways and enclosures in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, that the cattle were raised in the Welsh marches and must have been herded down by the hundreds, if not thousands, every so few years. You know, there were people and animals moving great distances during this period. And so you've got this massive range of hill forts, some of them very, very big. Why did they become unpopular? Well, the idea of hill forts, certainly by the late Iron Age, was one of wealth and social status. The problem with things like a hill fort or anything big is you need to keep it up. You need to stop it falling down. You need a lot of people to look after it, and these people have other things to do, like farm. And trying to organise a community that is agriculturally based to spend half the year shoring your hill fort up must have been incredibly difficult. Having done a series of excavations, we now think that most of our hill forts have been largely abandoned by 150 to 100 BC. And this is because, we think, that it coincides with the first evidence of coinage. And instead of having a massive hill fort, you've got a bag of shiny coins. And it's far easier to carry your shiny coins around and show people than it is to get people to come to your big hill fort. I think, honestly, it sounds mad, but it is that simple in many respects. I'm sure there are other sort of cultural problems as well, but when Croft Ambry was excavated, again, everything seems to have shut down shortly after 150 BC. And come on. So, and even earlier in some places. So in some of the middens, in places like the Doward, for example, on the hill fort there, the Middle Iron Age seems to have been just about the latest in some areas. So these hill forts gradually became disused, or at least disused for anything that they had been used before. And we even have military bases being constructed as soon as the Romans arrived in places like Credon Hill, i.e. the capital hill fort, and more locally, Brandon Camp, where you have massive Roman granaries being put up to feed the troops that are being housed in those big forts that we've looked at earlier. So when the Romans arrived, or before the Romans arrived, but when the Romans arrived, we already knew a lot about the Romans because we've been trading with them. So when the Romans decided to come here, and they did decide to come here, but they didn't want to come here. I'll read it out as well, but Britain enjoyed diplomatic and trading links with the Romans since at least 55 BC. And the Roman economic and cultural influence was a significant part of the British late Iron Age. So we were trading with them. Between 55 BC and the 40s AD, Britain was a series of client states, many of which paid tribute to Rome without direct military occupation. So we were loosely under their control, particularly the tribes on the south coast. By the 40s AD, the political landscape of Britain became increasingly unstable. The Cativalorni had displaced the Trinovantes and were threatening the Atrebates, who were particularly cooperative with Rome, and Rome sees this as a threat to continued trade. So it's all about money. Nothing changes, does it? Basically, the flow of goods coming out of Britain, whether that's food goods, whether it's tin, whether it's gold, whether it's iron, etc., was being disrupted and threatened. And it was because of this that Claudius launched the invasion with 20,000 troops. Now, we used the word invasion. I think the Americans, the world we live in, the Romans would have suggested these were actually a peacekeeping force in modern parlance, I'm sure. And there was a degree of resistance, and it didn't work, I think it's fair to say. The Romans gave them a 2-day battle near Rochester on the River Medway, which ended in defeat for the British. Togodumnus died shortly afterwards, and Caraticus, as we all know around here, goes into hiding in Wales. And 11 tribes in southern Britain surrender. That's not surrender in sort of, hands up in the air and give them all their weapons. I think they just agreed to cooperate, as they had done for the last 100 years or so. So, to put it in context, this line here was the sort of first line of the invasion, if you like. These were the principal tribes that the Romans had dealt with for the best part of a century before they came over. But having done that, And, you know, so this lot here were regarded as a sort of the middlemen bringing goods and food from here, but also from further afield. The Romans then said, well, we've come this far, you know, we want the stuff that's further into Wales and further north. So they then did their second push through here. You can see how busy it is with these different coloured arrows. These are all different campaigns for the Roman conquest of Wales. And it's very, very, very similar to the later Norman conquest, of course. And so they took over the whole of the southeast, and then they pushed further west and further north. And I think what it's showing us, particularly in Herefordshire, which is, of course, you know, just the other side of that line and straight underneath all these arrows, was that they came through Herefordshire, the Roman army. They used the terrain of Herefordshire by coming up the river valleys, and these are the known Roman roads. As you can see, they're not straight. And so these in the solid lines are ones that we can actually trace through aerial photographs, etc., or we've dug holes through. The dotted lines are assumed, let's say. But you can see that they're all going the sort of way that our principal rivers go, and they're following, most of them are following the river valleys. So this one running along the Wye, this one running back down the Wye, and so on and so forth. They're following valleys, and of course, here we are in a valley with at least 3 large Roman forts in it. So they're using this valley to go back through into Wales, and they're using this as the sort of main sort of stopping point, resupply and equip point before they start their campaigns, and then they come back here and sort themselves out and have another campaign the following summer. So as far as we know, Herefordshire are linked to the tribe called the Dubuni. We found coins from the Dubuni in Herefordshire, but that's as far as we know. We do not know for sure even what tribe in the Iron Age there was in Herefordshire. But we do know that the Romans put marching camps and forts all over the place, and it was really for the push into Wales. What we are thinking now, particularly when we see things like the Roman town of Kenchester, is that the town of Kenchester wasn't where people lived, it was full of shops. The people that ran Kenchester, and presumably the people that ran Credon Hill Fort before Kenchester was built, because they're probably one and the same group of people, lived at very large villas along the Bishopston Ridge just outside of the town of Kenchester. They did like their river crossings, and again we have the Roman river crossing at Lentwadine, Dine. Wardine seems to be the something to do with a river crossing. We have Blackwadine, etc. Bredwadine. So we have a series of Roman river crossings attached to towns and or forts, and it's really just to get the legions across into Wales. And here again we have our supply base at Brandon Camp and Credon Hill. And here's this slide again, or at least this slide without the red bits. This is showing the principal Roman forts up here. There's the Roman fort that was at Lentwadine. There's Brandon Camp, which had the Roman supply base on. Another fort down here. These 2 marching camps, and then this massive legionary fortress up here. And there's the hill fort up on Coxall Knoll. And there's Brandon Camp, and the eagle-eyed amongst you might see that there are some white lines across here and across here. And these are sort of multi-celled buildings which are granaries. So that's where they stored the grain to feed the Roman soldiers whilst they massed before going on to their campaigns into Wales. A nice secure place, and this is exactly what they were doing on top of Credon Hill as well. So whilst these were abandoned long before, they were reused as secure areas. And once the Romans left, and we enter what has been called until fairly recently the Dark Ages. People don't like calling it the Dark Ages anymore. It implies that we know nothing about them. What we do know is quite scant in Herefordshire as far as the Dark Ages are concerned. I think the assumption is that relatively little changed in the grand scheme of things. We know that things like Roman towns began to fall apart and were becoming disused, and that people did things in different ways from the way that the Romans organised things. But I think to all intents and purposes, while some would say that technology stepped back 150 to 200 years, everything remained, certainly in an agrarian community like Herefordshire, reasonably the same. People still went out to work, tended the fields, made pots, probably not quite as well as the Romans made pots, but they made pots and made a decent living. And of course, what didn't happen appears to have been a sort of vacuum of power, etc. I think what the Romans had left behind was a very well-ordered landscape of large villa estates, large farm estates, and these physical boundaries were still used throughout the post-Roman period and into the early Norman period. So we have things like this. This is a multi-celled building. You can see this one even clearer than the ones on Brandon, but it's quite similar. And then there's rows of dots in here. This is at a place called Freen's Court, which is just outside Sutton St Michael, near Morton-on-Lug, in the Lug Valley. And we excavated this many years ago now, because we were hoping that it was something to do with Offa's Palace, you know, big stone buildings. Looks very tempting. What we found was that this was an aisled barn of some huge size that had had a catastrophic fire in it in the late Saxon, very early Norman period, and that this appears to have been a sort of administrative block for bringing in the harvest and making sure that the people of Hereford, as it says in Domesday Book, spent their 3 days gathering the crops from the royal estate at Marden. The dates fit very, very well. So this is an example of what was probably originally a late Iron Age and Roman estate, continuing its life through the Saxon period and into the early medieval period. So, as I say, from a sort of a Herefordshire agricultural point of view, not much changed. And, you know, just because I like this picture, this is them gathering the corn in. Now, it's when we get into the early medieval period that our landscape starts to change quite rapidly. I think today we see rapid change in our landscape, but we forget that this isn't the first time this has happened. These things, as most of you will know, are now called ridge and furrow, or rig and furrow, depending on which part of Britain you come from. And these are the lines of the massive medieval ploughs that came through. They're always bent on this because the plough has to be pulled by 6 or 8 oxen, and the length of the furlong means that they never actually manage to straighten out after the turn. So they are always on these reversed S skeins. But that's because the mouldboard is nearly 3 feet high. So if there's farming folk in here, a 3-foot mouldboard, you can see how far down that would go and why you have these massive ridges with these furrows in. And it's fair to say that medieval ploughing probably destroyed 85% of the lowland earthworks that predated it. They just went through everything. So if there happened to have been a Roman marching camp up here, they wouldn't have taken any notice of that. If they couldn't use it, they'd have gone straight over it and it would have been levelled within 20 years using ploughing like this. So our landscape changed. You've got to imagine a landscape with these in, with no hedges, with trees that were managed up on the hill slopes, but the rest of it would be under the plough. and we're looking at what today we would call intensive arable over as much of Herefordshire as possible. The reason for this was that certainly by the early 1300s, we had a population in Herefordshire that we were struggling to feed. So we were ploughing up every corner of the county that we could. So the flat river valleys were obvious targets, but then we ran out of space and we started doing this. These are things called strip lynchets. You can see they're again, reversed S. This is a fairly steep hill by Lingen. So this is it, and it continues up into the woodland up here. So this is Lingen Valletson around here, and all of this was under the plough, and intensively under the plough in the early medieval period. And this, again, with these massive ridges all over, is the top of Garway Hill. Now, if you're going to plough the top of Garway Hill, you've got to be fairly desperate. I mean, not only do you plough Garway Hill, but you're bringing manure up onto it to try and get stuff to grow. So you're running out of room and you're running out of food. So Herefordshire must have had a population in the 1200s, early 1300s, that was far larger, I think, than we would have supposed 20 or 30 years ago. And the reason why we're finding all this now is largely through aerial photographs and sustained aerial survey that Herefordshire Council has done over the last 15 to 20 years. So we have this massive population, but of course these things are still here. If they'd continued to have been used all through the medieval period, they would have been ploughed one way, then another, and so on and so forth. And then they would have been, as smaller ploughs came in, they'd have been ploughed away and made less distinct. We can still see them because something happened in Herefordshire and the rest of, or most of the rest of Britain, that meant suddenly we didn't have as many people. And everyone's going to now say, well, that was the Black Death. And it sort of was, but not solely. What seems to have happened in Herefordshire and the West Midlands in general, and into Wales, of course, is that there was a sort of perfect storm, if you like, of bad timing, bad weather, and the plague. So that by the time the plague hit, we were already in dire straits as far as agriculture was concerned. We'd had some very strange weather events. North Herefordshire and Shropshire in the early 1300s had almost 10 years of famine and very, very hot summers. That didn't go well. We then had 10 or so years of very warm, wet weather. If you can remember 2007 and a couple of years since then, where we had all that unseasonable rain in June, July, with flooding events, etc. That's the sort of thing that we'd be talking about here, but year on year. And of course, back in those days, if you lost your harvest, you were in trouble. You couldn't bring some in from somewhere else. And that meant that you lost your seed corn for next year and so on and so forth, which meant that there was less seed to grow, which meant there was less work to do, which meant that people started leaving rural areas and going to towns and cities to try and find work, and were being displaced. And at the same time, they were catching horrible things like the common cold, which in those days used to kill people. So we were already, at least on one knee, we were already a very weakened society when the plague hit. And the plague hit a weakened society that wasn't eating enough. And it swept through rural areas such as Herefordshire, Shropshire, parts of Worcestershire and Wales. And it meant that the population almost halved in a generation. Now, I don't mean that half the people died. They didn't. But half the people either died or moved away and didn't come back. And therefore, you have areas such as this that are perfectly preserved, almost like a point in time. 1349, they ploughed that, and then they didn't, because they didn't need to anymore, because they could concentrate on the much easier land and produce better quality stuff, but less of it, if you see what I mean. So we have the intensification of arable, and in the river valleys we have this, which looks a bit like ridge and furrow, but isn't. This is water management for water meadows. And what we're doing here is we're purposefully moving water around. This is the River Lug in flood, and we're moving flood water across the valleys to take in the flood water. And this is why when you see lots of old properties, you say, why did they build them there? They must flood. Well, they didn't, because when they were built, you moved all the flood water around and it dissipated, and it very, very, very seldom flooded. We didn't have half the problems that we do now. So this is the last vestiges. This is near Shellick, just to the north of Hereford, of these ridge and furrow type structures with these central drains and then a back drain, and they'd take water off on a leat through here, let it run down through here and run down through there, and then the overflow would run down and back into the river, and then they'd take it off again and do the same again and again and again. And this meant that not only was the river dropping its silt on here, so that you were getting effectively free compost, if you like, but it meant that these fields were kept damper for longer in the summer, which meant that you could get 2 or 3 cuts of hay instead of 1 or 2 cuts of hay, or you had extra pasture for animals if there was a very hot season. So these were just about as valuable as intensive arable in the medieval and into the post-medieval period. In fact, most of these continued in some shape or form through into the late 18th, perhaps even very early 19th century. And it would be rude not to mention Brampton Bryan and Brampton Bryan Park at this point. This is the first edition Ordnance Survey map, 1886-7, and this is the extent of Brampton Bryan Park. And of course, as part of the sort of medieval landscape, in Herefordshire particularly, parks took in a huge amount of land. I think it's fair to describe Herefordshire as conservative with a capital C, even nowadays to a greater extent. But we still have quite a significant proportion of the county under parkland. And what it's doing very conveniently for field archaeologists such as myself is it's enclosing and encapsulating and preserving a very interesting sort of prison of extraordinary preservation of what has gone on over the last 800 to 900 years in very specific areas across the county. And during the early 2000s, I was asked to look at various parks across the county to find out just how well preserved some of the earthworks were and what they related to. And really, these parks are a sort of microcosm of archaeology and social history in their own right. And again, the next, this is a teaser really, the next lecture we'll go into the details of what's happening in Brampton Bryan Park and other deer parks close by. But it's fair to say that they are very, very complex things. Brampton Bryan is at least 3 parks and an area of intense arable inside. And that's just the medieval park, or parks. And the reason for all of this and the size of the population is really reflected in this map. These are the medieval towns that were trading centres for 50 years or more in the late 12 and early 1300s. So we have 18 towns in Herefordshire. And some of them are surprising. Much Cowan, for example. You wouldn't think of that as a town. Brampton Bryan, for example. You wouldn't think that as a town. Wigmore, Richard's Castle, Lions Hall, Huntington, Eardsley. So, Kilpeck, Lewis Harold. It's these sorts of things. These are towns because they had markets and fairs. They had royal decree that they were allowed to hold a market and a fair, and that's what made them towns. And of course, you have markets and towns, which means you have vast amounts of trade coming this way, and a very, very complex, I think it's fair to say, system to try and keep as many of these going as possible. Because, of course, your markets and fairs can only exist on 6 days of the week. So the competition was huge as to which ones were going to be more successful than others. And it got to the stage, and let's look at this little group round here, where you have Lyons Hall, Kington and Huntington. The Lyons Hall started life as a very large planned village, but we now know from excavation that the village was laid out, but was hardly ever, was actually only partially settled. And we think it's because when this was laid out, Kington saw that this was going to threaten the market of Kington. So Kington laid itself out, or was laid out, to capture the trade that was coming through from Radnorshire before it got to Lyons Hall. And Lyons Hall couldn't compete, and after about 50 or 60 years, it relinquished its right to a market and a fair, and never became a proper town, whereas Kington flourished. And that's really what's happening with these groups. Where you have one on its own, these seem to have lasted a lot longer because competition was less. And this is the first edition of Brampton Bryan, and I mean, it's an unusual plan, but you can see that you have a central street leading up to this sort of funny shape, isn't it? You've got a crossroads here, but it's got more than a sort of a sharp crossroads, and then you've got these two roads going off with this sort of almost sort of funnel shape in here. That's the market, and a side market perhaps leading up towards the church. So this is your marketplace, and then you have what appears to have been a planned area through here, either side of the central spine road. And whether this was actually used or to what extent this was filled in with living quarters, we don't know. But this was certainly intended, and it tried to be, a planned town for 50 years or so. And after the Black Death, this is how many were left, towns. So we go down quite drastically. The only surprises there perhaps are Pembridge survived and Webley survived as proper towns. The rest are, of course, still towns. But as you can see, they're much further apart, and normally they're on major rivers or on main routeways through across into Wales or up into Shropshire. And this, again, shows the extent of what Herefordshire was compared to what it is, or certainly what it was by 1600, 1700, and why historical geographers don't think, or didn't think, that Herefordshire was the same as the rest of the Midland system of agriculture. The rest of the Midlands seems to have had a very nucleated settlement. We, in Herefordshire, if you look at the first edition maps, it shows it as being very dispersed. Each one of these red dots represents either a shrunken or a deserted medieval settlement. So where you had 3 or 4 or 5 houses, you now have a farm, or you have nothing. And you can see the coverage is across the board, really. So population collapse. But that doesn't mean to say that everything went to rack and ruin, of course, because, as I said at the beginning, Herefordshire is very good at growing things, and some of the crops that it grows are unusual, or at least we think of it as unusual nowadays. Woodland, for example, is a crop. It is an agricultural industry. This is a wood on the border with Worcestershire, near Cradley. It's called, It's Hales End wood. And there's a very steep ridge here. And we've done some survey work in this. And those are all the archaeological sites that we can see that survive as earthworks in that one little wood. And a lot of them are to do with quarries, as you'd expect on a ridge. A lot of them are to do with charcoal production and saw pits. But a lot of them are to do with medieval fields. And most of this, you can see the words lynchet, lynchet, ridge and furrow, ridge and furrow, ridge and furrow, lynchet, 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 ridge and furrow. A lot of the woods where it was just about possible to plough them or to create strip lynchets, these banks almost like rice terraces, they did throughout woodland all over Herefordshire. So you have this sort of layering, or palimpsest, I think is the word that people use now, of different types of landscape use, one on top of another, with the earlier ones just showing through. So you have a agricultural landscape, a farming landscape, and then you have a managed woodland landscape with woodland industries going on over the top of it. And that's the same everywhere, even in Brampton Bryan. So here's a lot of the woodland in Brampton Bryan Park, and the little round dots are saw pits, the triangles are charcoal burning platforms, and the little square pit areas are building platforms where people used to live when they were doing the tree felling and the charcoal burning. So seasonal people were living and working in the woodland estate up here. And this was done throughout the medieval period and into the 18th and early 19th centuries in some areas. Very, very important industry. And if you were lucky, and this is 1915, you could afford a wonderful residence like this. This is the main road through Fownhope. This is where Fownhope Motors used to be. The Green Man is just here. These are effectively what we'd call hovels, I suppose, but they're quite nice hovels. I love the old lady lurking there, staring at Alfred Watkins, who's taking the photograph, thinking, what's that man doing? Hops is another thing, which again, you have or had local hop fields until fairly recently. Hop poles, they had to come from somewhere, managed woodland. I'm sure that a lot of the woodland on the parkland was coppiced for hop poles. And the rest, of course, we know, yes, nothing's changed. We have the stooks for bringing in the harvest still. Again, this is an Alfred Watkins photograph. So we have diversification, and here's the hops in full go. And one of the most important things for Herefordshire, I'm sure, cider. Cider orchards. Cider orchards have always been important in Herefordshire, but I think they really people sort of associated Herefordshire with cider more and more in the 17th and 18th and then into the early 19th centuries, where it became more and more industrialised rather than just a literally cottage or farmhouse industry. So we have these sort of mainstay, these hops, this woodland management, cider, and of course the arable, all going well for us in Herefordshire right through. So it's only fairly recently that we've had major change. These changes have been relatively slow and we haven't really noticed. They've crept up on us. It's not until the last 20 or 30 years that we've, been challenged by a degree of landscape and agricultural change. And this is what I mean. Here we have what was, as you can see here, this is the old hedge boundary running through here. And suddenly we have one massive field with a footpath running across it. Who can recognise this crop? We suddenly saw lots of them in the middle to late 80s. Potatoes. Yeah, spuds. Yes, exactly. Here's a spud map. This is areas used by hectare for potato production in the late 80s. And there's Herefordshire. The brighter, the more spuds. And this is us as far as the percentage of England's total arable land under the potato cultivation by county, and we come down here at number 7, but percentage of each county's total arable land under the potatoes, we come 3rd, which is quite surprising, after, funnily enough, Cambridgeshire and Norfolk, or Norfolk and Lincolnshire, so, which everyone knows is, you know, potato capital of the world. So potatoes were a major new thing for us on a scale that we hadn't seen before. And this did change the landscape quite considerably. And of course, since then, we've been encouraged, let's say, or farmers have been encouraged, and we as shoppers have been encouraged to perhaps buy new things or different things at different times of the year. And as a consequence, our landscape continues to change. Polytunnels, the sort of Marmite of agriculture. You either love them or hate them. So this is something that sort of started to appear again about 20, 25 years ago, and it grew rapidly, I think it's fair to say, and you know, caused quite a stir. I think the thing to remember, the way that I sort of look at it is, these things are changing rapidly. We need to remember that they're going to change again. And these are, let's say, temporary ways of farming. And of course, it's only going to get more confusing and unusual for us in the future, where we are growing as a population, where our landscape is having to adapt because our temperatures are having to change, and we are trying to do things in different ways. And it's very difficult, I think, in an area like Herefordshire to take on board major changes that happen very quickly. And here we have sort of the 3 sort of highlights. We have chicken sheds, which, let's face it, are never out of the news at the moment, and haven't been for many years. We have new crops or increased areas of crops, asparagus, for example. It's not necessarily the fact that asparagus and potatoes are being cultivated in massive areas. It's actually how they're being done as far as an archaeologist, and where they're being done. Potatoes, for example, they need, or the requirement for harvesting is a fairly stone-free soil. So they de-stone it first. In doing so, perhaps destroying quite a lot of the archaeological resource. For asparagus, there are kilometres and kilometres of water pipe to keep these things growing, which you don't see, which are planted under the ground, of course. And then we have areas that, you know, in certain locations, let's say, it may not be good to put massive solar farms in. You may spoil the look of a landscape. But these are things that we as a rural community are going to find increasingly pressurized to cope with and perhaps accept in one way or another. I'm trying not to be doom and gloom. It's not all bad, things do have benefits. And I think all of this is a massive learning curve as far as how we use our landscape, how we let our landscape be used, and how we weigh up the benefits, the pros and the cons, let's say, as to the short-term use of areas of Herefordshire. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.